A wealthy black entrepreneur named Ava Sinclair stepped into the first-class cabin of her flight after an exhausting day. Despite her incredible success in the tech and philanthropy world, Ava was known for her humility. She avoided the spotlight, always dressing simply and traveling discreetly. In her view, a person's worth was defined by their actions, not their appearance or wealth. Today was no different. Ava wore a beige coat over a pair of casual navy slacks and carried a small, understated handbag instead of the flashy designer luggage so often seen in first class. As she entered the cabin, she felt a wave of relief. The plush leather seats, the hushed atmosphere, it was a sharp contrast to the chaotic energy of the economy section behind her. Ava exhaled deeply, letting the stress of the day melt away. Hours of tense meetings were finally over, and the charitable project she had just finalized would soon improve the lives of thousands of families around the globe. For now, all she wanted was to lose herself in a book and enjoy the tranquility of the flight. Ava found her window seat, placed her handbag carefully in the overhead bin, and sat down, her fingers smoothing the soft blanket on her lap. Outside the window, the sun began to dip below the horizon, and Ava allowed herself a small, peaceful smile. She opened her bag, ready to pull out her book, but her moment of calm was interrupted. Standing before her was a flight attendant, Rachel Summers, a woman in her early 30s with years of experience in the airline industry. Rachel prided herself on maintaining a polished image and delivering top-notch service, particularly to first-class passengers. But something about Ava sitting there didn't sit well with her. Rachel's friendly professionalism vanished the moment she set eyes on Ava. She frowned slightly, her expression slipping into one of suspicion as her gaze lingered on Ava's simple attire and unassuming demeanor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rachel said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet cabin. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin? Economy seating is towards the back." The tone wasn't just one of inquiry, it carried an edge of judgment. Rachel's words clearly implied that Ava couldn't possibly belong in first class. Ava looked up, her eyes calm but sharp, meeting Rachel's skeptical gaze. Years of success hadn't shielded her from moments like this, moments when her skin color and appearance led others to doubt her worth. Ava remained composed. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Ava replied evenly. "This is my seat." Her words were firm but respectful, offering Rachel no reason to escalate. Yet Rachel's expression remained cold. She refused to accept Ava's assurance and pressed further. "I'm going to need to see your ticket," Rachel said, her tone clipped and dismissive. Ava didn't argue. Reaching into her handbag, she handed Rachel her ticket without hesitation. Ava's calm demeanor belied the frustration simmering inside. She had faced situations like this too many times to count, being underestimated, misjudged, or worse, humiliated. Rachel took the ticket and scrutinized it unnecessarily. She flipped it back and forth, eyes scanning it longer than required, searching for any reason, any mistake that would confirm her bias. Around them, other first-class passengers began to notice. The hum of conversation quieted, and curious glances flickered toward Ava and Rachel. Despite the growing tension, Ava held her ground. Her expression was controlled, but the slight furrow of her brow revealed her discomfort. She wasn't just being questioned. She was being accused. Finally, Rachel had no choice but to admit that Ava's ticket was valid. She handed it back with an unmistakable air of reluctance, her lips pressing into a thin line. But instead of an apology, Rachel said something that made Ava's blood run cold. "This seat doesn't seem to suit you," Rachel muttered under her breath, though loudly enough for Ava to hear. The words hung in the air like an insult wrapped in passive-aggressive professionalism. Ava Sinclair felt the anger bubbling inside her like a volcano, but she forced herself to stay composed. This wasn't her first time dealing with bias, and she had learned that reacting impulsively often made things worse. She had faced judgment before, based on her skin color, her modest appearance, or people's assumptions, but this time was different. This time, she was determined not to back down. Keeping her voice calm yet resolute, Ava met Rachel Summers' challenging gaze. "I demand that you stop this discriminatory behavior. My ticket is valid, and this is my seat. I will not move," Ava said firmly. Rachel's expression faltered for just a moment, her eyes flickering with discomfort. She wasn't used to passengers challenging her authority, especially someone she had already deemed unworthy of first class. The tension thickened, and the murmurs of nearby passengers began to rise. Heads turned, eyes darting toward the confrontation unfolding in the otherwise quiet cabin. Despite her outer calm, Ava felt a familiar ache deep inside. Discrimination, no matter how many times it happened, left scars. It was more than just a seat. It was about her right to be treated with fairness and dignity. She straightened her posture, her determination clear in her eyes as she looked directly at Rachel. Rachel, now feeling the weight of the passenger's stares, grew visibly frustrated. The calm, professional demeanor she had practiced for years slipped away, replaced by irritation and a simmering defiance. Instead of accepting the reality that Ava's ticket was perfectly valid, Rachel snatched it again from Ava's hand, inspecting it once more, far longer than necessary. There must be some kind of mistake, Rachel muttered, her voice edged with disbelief. She looked at the ticket, flipped it over, then cast another disdainful glance at Ava. Maybe the system glitched during booking. Her words were laced with an accusation. Ava didn't belong here, and Rachel was determined to prove it. Ava's patience wore thin. She clenched her fists under the blanket, forcing herself not to raise her voice. I've already told you, my ticket is valid. This is my seat, and I am not moving. If you don't believe me, I suggest you contact someone with more authority like the captain, Ava said, her voice measured but unyielding. Around them, the air in the cabin grew suffocating with tension. Some passengers exchanged awkward glances, while others openly stared at the scene unfolding before them. The collective silence only made the moment heavier. Rachel's frustration reached a boiling point. For years, passengers had complied with her requests without a second thought, but Ava refused to yield, and that refusal ignited something in her, an instinct to use her authority to regain control. Fine, Rachel snapped. If you insist on disrupting the flight, I'll call the captain to deal with this. She turned sharply on her heel, striding toward the cockpit with a huff. Moments later, the cockpit door swung open, and Captain Mark Holloway stepped into the cabin. Tall and imposing, with a stern face and streaks of gray at his temples, Mark had spent over 2 decades in the airline industry. He was a man who prided himself on maintaining order and authority on every flight. Rachel quickly approached him, whispering a few hurried words and glancing toward Ava with a look of exasperation. Captain Holloway's gaze followed Rachel's, landing on Ava with cold, judgmental eyes. Without asking a single question, without giving Ava the courtesy of explaining, he already seemed to have made up his mind. He walked briskly toward Ava, his posture rigid with authority. "What's going on here?" Holloway asked curtly, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care for the details. Before Ava could respond, Rachel jumped in. "This passenger is refusing to move and is causing a disturbance," she said quickly, her voice dripping with frustration. "She's disrupting the flight, Captain." Ava, who had sat silently as they spoke about her as if she wasn't there, finally interjected. Her voice was calm, but laced with controlled anger. "I am not causing a disturbance," she said clearly. "I am simply sitting in the seat I paid for. Your flight attendant has been treating me unfairly from the moment I boarded, as if I don't deserve to be here. This isn't about my ticket, it's about how I'm being treated." Captain Holloway didn't even flinch. He barely looked at Ava before turning his attention back to Rachel, as though her word alone was enough to settle the matter. His expression hardened and his voice turned icy. "You're disturbing the other passengers?" he said coldly, ignoring Ava's explanation completely. "If you don't comply with the flight attendant's request, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." The words hit Ava like a slap. She stared at the captain in disbelief. The injustice was infuriating. She hadn't done anything wrong. Nothing except sit in the seat she had rightfully purchased. Yet here she was, being threatened with removal because of someone else's prejudice. Deep down, Ava knew that Holloway wasn't making a decision based on facts. He hadn't bothered to check her ticket or listen to her side of the story. His bias had spoken louder than any explanation she could give. But Ava was no longer willing to let this slide. She met Captain Holloway's gaze, her eyes fierce and unrelenting. "I will not be intimidated. I have done nothing wrong, and I refuse to leave." If you want to escalate this further, I suggest you think carefully about the consequences. Her voice, though calm, carried a quiet authority, a reminder that she was not someone to be dismissed so easily. The cabin fell silent once more, passengers frozen as they watched the confrontation unfold. Some seemed sympathetic, others wary, but no one spoke. Captain Holloway, his expression stony, stood towering over Ava as if daring her to challenge him further. But what he didn't yet know, what Rachel and everyone else hadn't realized, was that Ava Sinclair was not just any passenger. And soon enough, their actions would lead to consequences they never saw coming. Part 3. The Breaking Point. Ava Sinclair stared at Captain Mark Holloway, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She was no stranger to judgment or prejudice, but to experience it here, in a place where she had paid for the highest level of service, was beyond comprehension. Ava's voice, though controlled, was sharp with outrage. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm simply sitting in the seat I paid for. This behavior is discriminatory, and I will not accept it." Captain Holloway, unmoved by her words, stared at her with cold, disdainful eyes. His authority, built over decades in the industry, left no room for challenges, especially from someone he had already dismissed in his mind. Then, in a moment of shocking anger and a complete loss of control, Holloway's hand shot up, and he slapped Ava hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, freezing everyone in place. Conversation stopped, jaws dropped, and every eye turned toward Ava and the captain. The atmosphere became heavy, suffocating in its silence. Ava's head tilted slightly from the impact, her cheeks stinging with pain. But worse than the physical blow was the public humiliation, the sheer audacity of a man, a pilot no less, resorting to such an act of violence. She slowly brought her hand to her cheek, feeling the heat of the mark rising under her fingertips. The passengers sat frozen in shock, their horrified gazes darting between Ava and Captain Holloway. For a long moment, no one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Ava's years of facing prejudice had taught her to master her emotions, even in moments like this. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, even as the hurt and humiliation churned inside her. She knew that losing control would only serve as justification for people like Holloway and his flight attendant, Rachel Summers. Captain Holloway, for his part, stood tall, unrepentant, and resolute. His voice was as cold as his demeanor when he said, "If you won't cooperate, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane immediately." To him, it was just a way to maintain control of the situation. He couldn't see, perhaps didn't care, that his actions weren't just inappropriate, they were morally and legally indefensible. Ava looked at him, her dark eyes now filled with anger and determination. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been treated as less, who had ever been humiliated because of their skin color, their gender, or their background. Ava stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and composed. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She reached for her handbag and looked Captain Holloway directly in the eye, her voice low but unwavering. "You'll regret this," she said. Her words were not a threat, they were a promise. Holloway's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, as if a part of him realized he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Ava turned and walked through the aisle with her head held high, her dignity intact despite the pain she carried inside. Passengers watched her, their faces a mixture of guilt, pity, and discomfort. A few avoided eye contact, perhaps afraid to intervene. Others looked at Holloway with silent disapproval, though none dared to speak up. As Ava reached the exit of the cabin, she paused. Turning back slightly, she locked eyes with Rachel, then with Captain Holloway. "You'll pay for this," she said again, her voice calm but filled with steely defiance. There was no yelling, no hysterics, only the quiet authority of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. With that, Ava stepped off the plane, leaving behind an atmosphere so heavy it seemed to linger in the air. Hours later, Ava sat in the quiet of the airport lounge, the events replaying in her mind like a loop. The sting on her cheek had faded, but the mark it left in her heart was still fresh. She had faced prejudice before, but never in such an openly hostile and public way. Yet Ava Sinclair was not one to crumble. Pulling out her phone, she began to take action. She was no longer just a humiliated passenger. She was Ava Sinclair, a billionaire, a leader, and unbeknownst to Rachel and Captain Holloway, the owner of the very airline they worked for. Ava made a call to her legal advisor first, her voice calm but firm. "I want an internal investigation launched immediately. I need every detail about that flight, the crew, and their records. Make it discreet for now, but thorough," she instructed. Within moments, her management team began sending her confirmation messages. The wheels were already turning. Ava didn't need this incident to turn into a media scandal. Not yet. She wanted to handle it her way, quietly, efficiently, and with undeniable force. This wasn't about revenge. Ava's mind was on something bigger. She wasn't going to just punish two individuals. She was going to root out the toxic culture that had allowed people like Rachel and Holloway to act with such impunity. As she sipped her tea in the lounge, Ava's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. She began mapping out a plan, one that would ensure no one else would ever have to experience what she just had. Rachel and Captain Holloway had underestimated her. To them, she had been just another passenger, someone they could belittle without consequence. But they had no idea who she truly was. The slap Holloway had delivered wasn't just a personal insult. It was a turning point. It was a spark that had ignited something much bigger. And soon, Rachel and Holloway would face consequences far greater than they could have imagined. For Ava, this wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. This was about setting a precedent, one that would change an entire industry. This is more than a single insult, Ava thought. It's a symptom of something deeper, and if no one stands up to fix it, it will only continue. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her chief of staff. Investigation underway. Teams are gathering witness statements from passengers and reviewing internal crew records. Expect updates soon. Ava leaned back in her seat, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She had no intention of reacting impulsively. Turning this into a public scandal might satisfy her immediate frustration, but Ava knew better. Real change demanded precision, strategy, and quiet force. She would collect every shred of evidence and make her move when the time was right. Her thoughts began to form into a concrete plan. This wasn't just about accountability, it was about reform. Ava envisioned a company where passengers would always be treated with fairness and dignity, regardless of their race, appearance, or background. "We need more than apologies," Ava murmured to herself. "We need systemic change." In her mind, the steps became clear. First, a thorough investigation. Every crew member's actions would be scrutinized. No excuses. Second, a complete overhaul of company policies. It wasn't enough to say the right things, they had to mean them. And third, perhaps most important, training programs that would change the mindset of every single employee. From the pilots to the flight attendants, ground staff, and executives, everyone would undergo mandatory cultural awareness and diversity training. It wouldn't just be empty words on a slide presentation. Ava would make sure it was immersive, real, and impactful. We don't just need policies on paper, Ava thought. We need to change hearts and minds. A soft notification from her phone confirmed her team had already taken the first steps. Lawyers and investigators were reaching out to passengers who had witnessed the incident, asking for statements. Ava knew the truth couldn't hide for long. She stood up, gathering her belongings and slipping her phone into her bag. Her heart was still heavy with what had happened, but her determination burned brighter than ever. As she walked out of the lounge, her mind was clear. She wasn't just a passenger who had been insulted. She was Ava Sinclair, and she had the power to reshape an entire industry. This wasn't just about justice for herself. It was about justice for everyone who had ever felt disrespected, silenced, or dismissed. As Ava stepped out into the bustling airport terminal, her calm exterior gave no hint of the storm brewing inside her. Rachel Summers and Captain Mark Holloway had no idea what they had set in motion. To them, Ava had been an anonymous passenger, someone they could dismiss without consequence. But they were wrong. In a matter of hours, Ava's team would uncover not just this incident, but any similar behavior hidden within the airline's operations. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. Ava would make sure of that. Her vision extended far beyond punishing the individuals responsible. She wanted to transform her airline into a model of equality, respect, and fairness, a symbol of what the industry should be. The next morning, Ava sat at her office desk, overlooking the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her legal team had already compiled an initial report. Witnesses had confirmed what had happened. The evidence was irrefutable. Ava's chief of staff entered the room, placing a folder on her desk. "We've gathered statements from multiple passengers," he said. "Everyone backs up your account. Captain Holloway's slap, Rachel's discriminatory behavior. It's all here." Ava nodded, flipping through the documents. "Good. Make sure we continue to investigate thoroughly. I want to know if there's been a pattern, any past complaints or incidents we've overlooked. And don't let anyone think they're above scrutiny." Her chief of staff hesitated. "You're not planning to go public with this yet, are you?" Ava shook her head. "Not yet. If we're going to fix this, we need to fix it from the ground up. I'm not interested in headlines. I'm interested in real, lasting change." That day, Ava began drafting a blueprint for the airline's reform. She outlined new standards for training, a revamped complaint system, and zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory behavior. She also made plans to personally oversee the implementation, ensuring these changes weren't just lip service, but a meaningful shift in the company's culture. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. Ava was no longer thinking about herself. She was thinking about the future. A future where passengers like her would never again have to endure what she had experienced. As she closed her laptop for the night, Ava felt a sense of resolve. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She would face resistance, pushback, and doubt. But Ava Sinclair had built empires from the ground up before. This would be no different. The battle has only just begun, Ava thought, a small determined smile forming on her lips. As Ava Sinclair stepped out of the airport, her stride was purposeful, her determination burning like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. Rachel Summers and Captain Mark Holloway might have thought they had won by forcing her off that plane, but they were gravely mistaken. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Ava Sinclair, a visionary leader with the power to change not only their lives, but an entire industry. They won't know what hit them, Ava thought, her eyes blazing with resolve. This was no longer just about her personal humiliation. This was about dismantling a broken system and creating an environment where every customer, regardless of race, background, or appearance, would be treated with fairness and respect. Ava's management team wasted no time. Within hours of receiving her directives, they sprang into action. Lawyers and executives contacted passengers who had been seated near Ava in first class. Witnesses were asked to provide detailed accounts of the incident, what they saw, what they heard, and how the flight crew behaved. The investigation was kept strictly confidential, as Ava had instructed. She wasn't interested in sensational headlines or public scandals, not yet. Change, she knew, had to come from within. If the airline was to rebuild its values, it couldn't be under the duress of media frenzy. "We'll handle this quietly, but with precision," Ava had said to her team. "We're going to fix this properly." In the days that followed, Ava met with her team of advisors, strategists, and legal experts to outline a broader vision for reform. This wasn't just about punishing two individuals. It was about reshaping the entire culture of her airline, a culture that had clearly tolerated discrimination far too long. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," Ava explained to her team. "It's a reflection of deeper problems. We need to address this systemically. Every corner of the company has to change." Her first initiative was a mandatory cultural sensitivity and anti-discrimination program. This wouldn't be a dull series of lectures. Ava demanded hands-on training, using real-world scenarios to show employees the real impact of their actions, whether intentional or not. From pilots to flight attendants, ground staff to senior management, no one would be exempt. As Ava dug deeper into the company's customer service practices, she uncovered unsettling truths. Numerous complaints had been filed over the years by passengers of color, elderly individuals, and other minority groups, claiming unfair treatment or disrespectful behavior. Most of these complaints had been handled superficially, or worse, completely ignored. Ava was outraged but unsurprised. "No more," she said firmly. She ordered the creation of a new customer complaint system, one that would ensure every concern was investigated thoroughly and fairly. Each report would be treated with the seriousness it deserved, with clear accountability and consequences for inappropriate behavior. If passengers speak up, they need to know they'll be heard, she told her team. We can't sweep these issues under the rug anymore. The investigation into Rachel Summers and Captain Holloway uncovered even more troubling information. Both crew members had spotless performance records on paper, but witness statements painted a very different picture. Rachel had a reputation for being dismissive toward passengers she deemed unworthy of first-class treatment. Holloway, while respected for his piloting skills, was known for his unyielding pride and tendency to escalate situations rather than diffuse them. Ava's findings also revealed that similar incidents had occurred in the past, instances where bias and unprofessionalism had gone unaddressed. This discovery only strengthened her resolve. News of the investigation spread quietly among the airline's employees. Rachel, upon learning she was being scrutinized, was shaken. To her, the incident on the plane had been routine. She hadn't expected her actions to escalate into a full-blown crisis. Captain Holloway, on the other hand, remained defiant. He was confident he had acted appropriately to maintain order. But as pressure from the investigation mounted, cracks in his confidence began to show. Management was no longer treating this as a small misunderstanding. They saw it for what it truly was, a reflection of larger cultural failings within the company. This is not just about one flight, she said, her voice steady and commanding. What happened to me is a symptom of a larger problem, one we can no longer ignore. She laid out the findings of the investigation in meticulous detail, leaving no room for argument or denial. The executives listened intently, their faces growing more serious with every revelation. Ava didn't sugarcoat the truth. We have failed our customers, she stated firmly, and if we don't fix this now, we will continue to fail them. I will not let that happen. Ava Sinclair stood at the front of the sleek, glass-walled boardroom, the weight of the moment evident in her poised stance. Seated before her were the airline's senior leaders, men and women whose decisions shaped the company's culture and reputation. Today was not business as usual. Today was about accountability and transformation. The findings of the investigation had been meticulously compiled, and Ava left no room for ambiguity as she presented the report. Charts, witness testimonies, and specific examples revealed what had happened on that flight and uncovered systemic issues that had long been ignored. This isn't just about one incident, Ava said, her voice firm and steady. This is about the environment we've allowed to exist. An environment where prejudice can flourish unchecked. It's time for that to change. She laid out a comprehensive action plan, detailing clear steps the company must take to rebuild trust with its customers and employees. We will be held accountable, Ava emphasized, not just for what happened to me, but for ensuring that this company becomes a symbol of fairness, respect, and excellence. The senior leaders sat in silence, absorbing her words. They knew Ava was right. If they failed to act decisively, the company's reputation and future could crumble. When the meeting ended, Ava felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was prepared. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a legacy of change. With the reform plan approved, Ava's team wasted no time. The first step was launching a cultural awareness and anti-discrimination training program for every single employee. From pilots and flight attendants to ground crew and executives, no one was exempt. The training was different from standard corporate sessions. Instead of dry lectures, it used real-world scenarios, situations employees encountered daily. It challenged them to recognize unconscious bias, understand its impact, and learn how to treat every passenger and colleague with the respect they deserved, regardless of race, age, or background. For Rachel Summers and Captain Mark Holloway, the changes hit particularly hard. Rachel, once so confident in her abilities and position, found herself on the receiving end of whispers and side glances from her colleagues. Those who had once laughed at her jokes now avoided her, worried about being associated with her actions. The incident had become a company-wide topic, and Rachel felt its weight pressing down on her. When Rachel was told she had to attend the mandatory training, she reacted with anger and defensiveness. "I didn't do anything wrong," she protested to a colleague. It was just a misunderstanding. But as the training began, Rachel's confidence wavered. She was forced to confront stories and perspectives she had never considered. Stories of passengers who had been humiliated, ignored, or judged simply for who they were. She watched videos of real incidents, listened to first-hand accounts, and participated in role-playing exercises that put her in the shoes of those she had mistreated. The more Rachel engaged with the training, the harder it became to deny the truth. She began to see that the biases she had believed were harmless had caused real pain to others. The moment she remembered Ava's calm, defiant expression as she stood her ground, something inside her shifted. Rachel's anger turned to shame. For the first time, she truly regretted what she had done, not because of the consequences she faced, but because she realized she had been wrong. Meanwhile, Captain Mark Holloway, who had spent years commanding the respect of his crew, found his confidence cracking under the pressure of the investigation and training. Mark had always seen himself as a leader, someone who maintained order at all costs. Initially, he justified his actions on the flight, believing he had simply been enforcing authority. But as the training progressed, Mark couldn't ignore the stories he heard. Role-playing exercises forced him to experience scenarios where he was judged unfairly or treated with disdain. For the first time, he saw his behavior through a different lens. In one exercise, he played the role of a passenger being unfairly targeted by airline staff. The frustration, humiliation, and helplessness he felt in that moment hit him like a ton of bricks. He remembered Ava's words on the plane, her calm insistence that she had done nothing wrong, and the sting of regret settled deep in his chest. For weeks, the airline buzzed with change. Employees who had initially grumbled about the mandatory training soon realized that it wasn't just a superficial exercise. They began to see how small, seemingly harmless actions could have a significant impact on someone's experience. Colleagues who had previously ignored issues of bias began speaking up. Teams held open discussions about how to treat passengers and coworkers with more empathy and understanding. The company's culture was beginning to shift. Slowly but unmistakably. Ava monitored the progress from a distance, receiving regular updates from her team. She didn't need to micromanage the process. Her influence was already deeply felt. The employees knew that the changes weren't optional. Ava's quiet but powerful leadership had set a tone of accountability that could not be ignored. Rachel and Mark were no longer the confident, unshakable figures they had once been. The investigation and training had forced them to look inward, to confront their flaws and question their attitudes. As the airline-wide reform programs continued, Ava Sinclair's vision of change was steadily taking shape. Employees across the company participated in mandatory cultural awareness and anti-discrimination training, no matter their position. The message was clear: this transformation was everyone's responsibility. During the sessions, employees began to realize how seemingly small actions, a dismissive glance, an unnecessary question, or a subtle assumption, could leave a lasting impact on a person. Complaints were no longer buried or ignored. They were investigated transparently and thoroughly. The airline had promised its customers a new era of fairness and respect, and for the first time, passengers began to believe it. For people like Ava, those who had endured prejudice in silence, there was now a system that heard their voices. Amid the sweeping changes, the most unexpected transformations were happening to Rachel Summers and Captain Mark Holloway, the two individuals who had wronged Ava the most. At first, Rachel approached the training sessions with resistance. She walked into the room with her arms crossed, a skeptical expression on her face. In her mind, she still justified her behavior. "I was just doing my job," she would tell herself, clinging to the belief that what had happened with Ava was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But as the weeks passed and the training sessions continued, something began to shift within Rachel. One afternoon, during a discussion on cultural awareness, a colleague shared a personal story. He recounted witnessing a black passenger being treated with subtle disdain by airport staff, ignored, scrutinized, and spoken to with far less respect than others. Rachel sat silently as he spoke, her fingers fidgeting with her pen. For the first time, guilt began to settle in her chest. She remembered Ava's face on that day, the calm but piercing look in her eyes when Rachel had questioned her right to sit in first class. Rachel realized that it hadn't just been about checking a ticket. It had been about suspicion, bias, and an assumption rooted in prejudice. That evening, Rachel sat alone at a small cafe, staring blankly at the busy streets outside. She turned her coffee cup between her hands, her thoughts swirling. The stories she'd heard during training wouldn't leave her mind. They had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, truths she'd spent years ignoring. Rachel had always thought of herself as fair and professional, but now she realized her actions that day had been neither. It wasn't just a mistake, she whispered to herself. It was wrong. For the first time, the idea of apologizing, something she'd once dismissed as unnecessary, felt like the only way forward. But it wouldn't be a forced apology to satisfy the investigation. Rachel knew that if she wanted to make things right, she would need to face Ava as a person, not as someone under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Captain Mark Holloway, a man who had spent years commanding respect as a pilot, wrestled with his own transformation. At first, he approached the training with indifference, considering it a pointless exercise. In his mind, his actions on the flight were justified. Slapping Ava, he believed, had been necessary to maintain control. But during a role-playing exercise in one of the training sessions, everything changed. In the exercise, Mark was asked to play the role of a passenger who was being judged unfairly. The staff, following the scenario, treated him with suspicion, questioning his every move. Mark wasn't allowed to explain himself, wasn't given the benefit of the doubt, and was spoken to in tones that made him feel small. For the first time, Mark felt the sting of being judged for something other than his skills, competence, or authority. A quiet discomfort crept through him as he imagined what Ava must have felt that day, cornered, humiliated, and dismissed without a voice. When the exercise ended, Mark sat quietly, staring at the floor. His usual confidence had been replaced with something heavier, an unfamiliar sense of regret. The following morning, Mark walked into the operations room with a noticeably different demeanor. His shoulders, once held high with pride, were now weighed down with reflection. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. The smugness was gone, replaced by a somber seriousness. Later that day, Mark requested a private meeting with his supervisor. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I need to talk to Ava Sinclair," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with guilt. "I need to apologize." His supervisor raised an eyebrow in surprise. This was not the same Mark Holloway they had known for years. Rachel and Mark's transformations were not sudden. They were gradual, the result of weeks of listening, learning, and reflecting. For Rachel, it was the realization that her professionalism had been laced with unconscious bias. For Mark, it was the humbling experience of seeing himself through the eyes of someone who had been wronged. Ava monitored the process from afar, receiving regular updates from her team. She didn't need to be physically present to see the impact of the reforms she had set in motion. The ripple effects were spreading across the entire company. Employees who had once turned a blind eye to discrimination were now holding themselves and each other accountable. But what Ava valued most was the internal change happening within Rachel and Mark. Their arrogance had been replaced by humility, and their defensiveness had turned into genuine reflection. The company's employees, once skeptical of the mandatory training, began to see its value. Colleagues shared stories, listened to one another, and learned how to treat every passenger with respect and dignity. For the first time, there was a tangible shift in the airline's culture. Passengers noticed it too. Complaints decreased, and positive feedback began pouring in. Customers spoke of feeling seen, heard, and valued, a sharp contrast to the stories that had once been buried in the system. For Ava, this was only the beginning. The path to lasting change would be long, but she knew she was moving in the right direction. One afternoon, Ava received a message from her assistant. "Captain Holloway and Rachel Summers have requested a meeting with you. They want to speak with you directly." Ava stared at the message for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She had expected this day to come, but she wasn't sure if Rachel and Mark were truly ready to face her, or themselves. With a deep breath, Ava replied, "Schedule the meeting." The time had come for them to take responsibility, not because they were forced to, but because they understood the weight of their actions. Captain Mark Holloway knew that no apology could undo what he had done, but he also understood that acknowledging his actions was the first step toward making things right. He had spent weeks reflecting on that day, on the slap, the humiliation he had caused, and his refusal to see Ava Sinclair as more than just a challenge to his authority. Now, humbled by the cultural awareness training and the growing impact of Ava's reforms, Mark requested the opportunity to speak to her personally. For the first time in years, he felt genuine remorse, not just for the consequences he was facing, but for the damage his actions had inflicted. From a distance, Ava had been observing both Mark and Rachel Summers. She didn't need their immediate apologies or displays of guilt. What mattered to her was growth, and she could see it happening. The two individuals who had once caused her so much pain were slowly learning the lessons she had hoped they would. Rachel, once brimming with defensiveness and pride, now walked through her days with quieter humility. She had begun treating passengers differently, not because she feared punishment, but because she understood the weight of her actions. Mark, whose arrogance had once been a defining trait, now carried himself with a seriousness born of reflection and regret. The transformation wasn't limited to Rachel and Mark. The training programs Ava had implemented were spreading change throughout the company. Employees, from fresh hires to veterans with decades of experience, began to shift their attitudes. They realized that even small gestures, careless words, or seemingly insignificant actions could leave lasting scars on passengers. The customer service culture was evolving, and with it, a new spirit of solidarity and respect emerged. Employees held each other accountable, and conversations about fairness and empathy became part of daily work life. Ava sat in her office one afternoon, reading through the latest reports from her team. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Passengers were reporting improved service, staff morale was rising, and customer complaints had decreased. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The impact of her efforts was becoming real, not just on paper, but in the hearts and minds of the people who made up the airline. It wasn't just about transforming one company anymore. Ava realized she was helping change how people treated each other in their everyday lives. But she also knew that these were just the first steps. True, lasting reform required vigilance and long-term commitment. Once the mandatory training sessions were completed, Ava called for a thorough evaluation of the airline's customer service processes. Every step of the passenger experience, from buying a ticket to checking in and boarding, was reviewed and improved. Ava wanted to ensure that no customer would ever be made to feel lesser simply because they didn't match someone's preconceived image of a typical first-class passenger. She also implemented an anonymous feedback system for both passengers and employees. People could now share their experiences, both good and bad, without fear of retaliation. Every piece of feedback would be taken seriously, no matter how minor it seemed. Ava understood that giving people a voice was essential to building trust and ensuring accountability. If we want a culture of fairness, Ava told her leadership team, we need to listen, truly listen, to what our passengers and employees have to say. The reforms didn't stop there. Ava recognized the need to address how the airline managed and assessed its employees. She called for a complete overhaul of the hiring and evaluation processes to ensure that candidates were selected for their skills, empathy, and attitudes, not because they fit some outdated image of what an airline employee should look like. Existing employees would also be evaluated not just on technical performance, but on how they treated customers and colleagues. Respect, fairness, and professionalism would become core metrics for success. Ava placed a particular focus on recruiting and mentoring younger employees. She believed that instilling the values of empathy and respect in the next generation of staff would be the key to creating lasting change. If we plant these seeds now, she said, then one day behaviors like the ones I experienced will be nothing but relics of the past. To ensure these values reached every corner of the company, Ava launched a leadership development program. Employees who demonstrated empathy, respect, and a genuine commitment to fairness would be trained to become the company's future leaders. Ava knew that real change had to come from the top, and she was determined to cultivate a new generation of managers who would champion the culture she was building. While Ava received strong support from many employees and managers who recognized the importance of these changes, not everyone agreed with her reforms. Some long-standing executives resisted the changes, arguing that the rapid and widespread overhaul could disrupt operations. Change takes time, one senior manager said during a meeting. Too much, too fast, it's going to create chaos. But Ava remained steadfast. This isn't chaos, she replied calmly. This is progress. We can't delay what needs to be done simply because it's uncomfortable. If we don't act now, we'll never move forward. Her determination was unshakable. She knew that resistance was a natural part of any transformation, and she was prepared to face it head-on. As the changes began to take effect, Ava received an increasing number of positive reports. Passengers were noticing a difference in the airline's service. Many commented that the atmosphere felt more welcoming, and they were treated with genuine courtesy and respect. One customer wrote, "I've never felt so valued on a flight before. The crew was professional, kind, and attentive. It's clear this airline has truly changed." Employees also began to share their stories. Some who had once felt overlooked or marginalized spoke up, saying the work environment had transformed. They felt heard, valued, and empowered to perform their jobs with pride. Even Rachel Summers and Captain Mark Holloway, two people who had once been symbols of the company's problems, had fully embraced the reforms. Their transformations were remarkable. Rachel, after months of reflection and growth, became one of the most vocal advocates for the new company culture. She had gone from being defensive to understanding the impact of her past behavior. Now she was a pioneer of change, encouraging her colleagues to treat every passenger with respect and dignity. Rachel often shared her story with others, admitting, "I used to think treating people well was just part of the job, but now I see it's more than that. It's a privilege and a joy." Mark Holloway's transformation was equally inspiring. Once rigid and proud, Mark now carried himself with a newfound humility. He had volunteered to assist with training new pilots, sharing his story as an example of how arrogance and quick judgments could lead to harmful consequences. "I used to think leadership meant control," Mark admitted during one training session. "But I've learned that true strength comes from listening, understanding, and treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are." His words resonated deeply, and his willingness to share his mistakes earned him respect from both new and seasoned employees. Ava observed all of this from a distance, her heart swelling with satisfaction. The values she had fought for were no longer just words on paper, they were becoming ingrained in the company's DNA. Employees weren't just complying with new rules, they were actively embracing and embodying the principles of fairness and respect. The ripple effect was undeniable. Customer satisfaction scores soared, complaints dropped significantly, and employee morale reached new heights. What had once seemed like an impossible task was now a tangible success. Ava smiled as she reviewed the latest reports, feeling both pride and determination. She knew this was just the beginning. Real change required constant nurturing to ensure the progress she had fought so hard for would continue to grow. On a crisp, sunny morning, Ava was invited to a special meeting at the airline's headquarters. This gathering was a celebration of the company's progress. Senior leaders, department heads, and employees from across the organization were there to report on the impact of the reforms. As Ava entered the conference room, she noticed the familiar faces of those who had supported her vision, people who had stood by her during the toughest days of the transformation. She also saw the faces of those who had once resisted, but had since come to respect and admire her leadership. A quiet hush fell over the room as the meeting began. One by one, leaders shared updates on the company's progress. Customer feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. Many passengers, especially those who had once felt marginalized or disrespected, now felt welcomed and valued. Complaints about bias and unfair treatment had nearly disappeared, replaced by stories of professionalism and kindness. Employees, too, reported feeling a stronger sense of purpose. The workplace had become more inclusive, and teamwork had flourished. But the highlight of the meeting came when Rachel Summers and Mark Holloway stood to share their personal journeys. Rachel's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her sincerity was undeniable. "That confrontation with Ava Sinclair was the turning point in my life," she said. "At first, I was angry. I thought I was just doing my job, but the training sessions helped me realize that I had been wrong, not just that day, but in how I approached my work. I've learned that respect and kindness aren't optional, they're essential, and I carry that lesson with me every day." Rachel paused, her eyes glistening. "I didn't just become a better employee, I became a better person." Mark followed, his deep voice steady but full of emotion. "For years, I thought I was always right because of my experience. I saw authority as something that couldn't be questioned. But through this process, I've learned that leadership isn't about control, it's about listening and understanding." He looked around the room, his expression earnest. "That day on the plane, I failed to see Ava as a person. I let my pride and bias cloud my judgment, but this experience has taught me humility, and I'll spend the rest of my career making sure I never make the same mistake again." When Mark finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Sitting in the back of the room, Ava felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She hadn't just changed two people, she had changed an entire system. What had begun as a painful moment of humiliation had turned into a movement that transformed an entire company. But Ava knew the journey wasn't over. The progress they had made was only the foundation. True transformation required vigilance and commitment to protect and grow the values they had built. As the applause subsided, Ava stood up, her voice carrying across the room. "This isn't just about creating a better airline. It's about setting a standard for how people should treat one another. We've come a long way, but the work isn't finished. Let's keep building on what we've started and ensure that fairness, respect, and empathy become the legacy we leave behind." The room erupted once again with applause and standing ovations. Employees and leaders alike knew that Ava Sinclair had not only transformed their company, but had also shown them the power of perseverance, leadership, and compassion. As Ava stepped out of the conference room, she paused in the hallway for a moment, taking it all in. To anyone else, the day might have seemed ordinary. Employees bustled past, conversations buzzed, and the hum of daily operations filled the air. But to Ava, everything felt different. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something far more important had: the hearts and minds of the people who made up her airline. Ava stepped outside and drew a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The sky stretched endlessly above her, clear and full of possibility. She knew this journey would never truly be over. Maintaining what she had built would take constant effort, and there would always be challenges ahead. But for now, Ava allowed herself to feel pride. Her determination and perseverance had transformed not just a company but the lives of countless employees and passengers. What had started as a personal humiliation had become a movement for fairness, respect, and dignity. Ava's story wasn't just about overcoming an injustice. It was about rising up to create systemic change. She had turned pain into purpose, transforming her hurt into strength and using it to build a better, more just world. Her journey serves as a powerful reminder that every small action matters. Change may take time, but with perseverance, courage, and belief, we can create a fairer world, one step at a time. If this story has inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, change, and the fight for a better future. Together, we can spread positivity, embrace fairness, and make the world a better place for all.